Imagine walking the streets of London today, amidst the hustle and bustle, but just beneath the surface lies a layer of ash and charred earth, a snapshot of a rebellion that shook Roman Britain to its core.
It's the legacy of Boudica, a warrior queen who dared to challenge the might of Rome.
And her story is one of courage, defiance, and ultimately tragedy. We'll be diving deep into the events that led to her uprising and why her name still resonates today.
It wasn't just a fleeting moment of defiance, it had a lasting impact on the course of Roman Britain, shaping the very landscape we see today.
So let's set the stage. Roman Britain in the 1st century AD. It's about 60 AD, roughly 15 years after the Roman legions under Emperor Claudius, crossed the English Channel. What was life like for the Britons under Roman rule?
Well, Roman control at this time was far from a done deal. Picture it more like a patchwork quilt with varying degrees of Roman influence across different regions. In the southeast, where Roman power was most concentrated, you had cities like Colchester, or Camulodunum as the Romans called it, which served as the provincial capital.
So these urban centers, they were meant to showcase Roman power, attract settlers.
Exactly. They had grand temples, bustling marketplaces, and veteran colonies where retired Roman soldiers were granted land, ensuring a loyal military presence.
So like the Roman version of early retirees settling down in a new land.
Precisely. And these settlements played a crucial role in solidifying Roman control. However, further away from the southeast, things were quite different.
Less Romanized.
Yes. In these areas, the Romans often adopted a more hands-off approach, relying on local rulers to maintain order.
Like outsourcing their administration.
Precisely. These local rulers, known as client kings or queens, were essentially puppets of Rome, allowed to maintain a semblance of authority in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, was one such client king ruling over the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia.
So Britain wasn't exactly a unified, peaceful Roman province then.
Far from it. Remember, Britain had been a thorn in the side of Roman emperors since Julius Caesar's attempted invasions centuries earlier. The land was fertile and strategically important, but the fierce native tribes made it a constant challenge to conquer and control.
I guess some things never change, but in this volatile environment where Roman authority was still being established, why did Boudica's tribe, the Iceni, who seemingly had peaceful relations with Rome under her husband's rule, choose to revolt? What was the trigger?
The death of Prasutagus was the spark that ignited the fire. He had been a loyal client king, carefully navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Upon his death, he attempted to secure his family's future by bequeathing his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero. He hoped this gesture of goodwill would protect his family and people.
Seems like a reasonable plan, trying to appease the most powerful man in the world.
Yes, but the Romans saw an opportunity. They disregarded Prasutagus' will completely. Client kingship, in their view, was a personal agreement, not something that automatically transferred to heirs. And with Prasutagus gone, they saw a chance to assert direct control over the Iceni and seize their valuable lands.
So the Romans basically decided to throw the treaty out the window.
Essentially. What followed was a blatant act of betrayal and brutality. Roman officials and soldiers descended upon Prasutagus' household.
Oh, no.
His lands were confiscated, his daughters were assaulted, and his family was enslaved. It was a message to the Iceni and all other client kingdoms. Rome would tolerate no dissent.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It certainly was. And for Boudica, this was more than a political maneuver. It was a personal and national insult. She saw the Romans' actions as a direct attack on her family, her people, and her very identity.
So she became a rallying point for all those who felt wronged by Rome.
Exactly. Boudica, fueled by grief, anger, and a fierce determination to avenge the wrongs inflicted upon her family, transformed from a grieving widow into a symbol of resistance. She quickly emerged as a powerful leader, unifying discontented tribes across Britain, particularly the Trinovantes, who had their own scores to settle with Roman rule.
Now this is where things get interesting. Let's talk about Boudica's campaign. Where did this rebellion strike first?
Her first target was a symbol of Roman power and arrogance in Britain, Colchester. It was swift and brutal.
So Colchester was caught completely off guard.
They were. At that time, Colchester lacked proper defenses, relying on the perceived stability of Roman rule. They hadn't anticipated such a ferocious uprising, and the archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of the chaos that ensued. We find remnants of meals interrupted like oyster shells left mid-dinner as people fled for their lives. Others tried desperately to bury their valuables, hoping to return for them later, a poignant sign of how quickly their world was turned upside down.
It must have been utterly terrifying for them.
You can only imagine the Romans, including many veterans and their families, made a last stand in the Temple of Claudius, a grand structure dedicated to the very emperor who had initiated the conquest of Britain.
It seems almost poetic that they would meet their end in a temple dedicated to their former emperor.
It was a symbolic choice for sure, but Boudica showed no mercy. The temple was overrun and every Roman inside was slaughtered. Colchester was razed to the ground, a smoldering testament to Boudica's fury and determination.
It's easy to get swept up in the narrative of rebellion, but this was a massacre. It raises an important question about how we view historical figures like Boudica. What are your thoughts on the moral complexities of her actions?
It's a valid point. We admire her courage and leadership, but we also have to acknowledge the brutality of the revolt. War is never a clean or simple affair.
And this was a war for survival, a desperate fight against an empire that had shown its true colors.
Precisely, Boudica's campaign was far from over. Flush with victory at Colchester, her forces marched south, their sights set on another prize, a settlement that would one day become the heart of a global empire, Londinium. Londinium, or London as we know it today, was a bustling trading center, a symbol of Roman ambition in Britain. But to Boudica, it represented the heart of the enemy, a place where Roman merchants and officials profited from the exploitation of her people.
So London, too, felt the full force of Boudica's wrath.
Indeed. Much like Colchester, those who could flee did. But many, especially the vulnerable, were left behind. What followed was a scene of utter devastation. If you were to dig beneath the layers of modern London, you'd find the same chilling evidence, the Boudica destruction layer, a layer of ash and debris that marks the fiery end of Roman Londinium.
It seems that Boudica's forces were intent on wiping out any trace of Roman presence.
Their actions were fueled by a potent mix of righteous anger, a desire for vengeance, and perhaps a desperate hope to break free from Roman rule once and for all.
And in this chaos, it seems, the lines between rebellion and retribution became blurred. Reports suggest that Roman women were specifically targeted in Londinium, subjected to horrific acts of violence.
It's important to remember that our primary sources for this period come from Roman historians like Tacitus, who undoubtedly had their own biases and agendas. They were writing for a Roman audience, and portraying their enemies as bloodthirsty barbarians served their purpose.
So we need to read between the lines and consider the possibility of exaggeration and propaganda?
Absolutely. It's always a challenge to separate fact from fiction, especially when dealing with ancient sources. But even with that caveat, it's clear that the events in Londinium were brutal, and that Boudica's forces were not simply interested in military victory. They wanted to inflict pain and suffering on their oppressors.
It's a reminder that history is often messy and complex, filled with shades of gray, rather than clear-cut heroes and villains.
Exactly, and it's through exploring those complexities that we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the past.
Well, while Boudica's rebellion was raging across southern Britain, what was the Roman response? Where was their top general Suetonius Paulinus during all of this?
Interestingly enough, Suetonius, the Roman governor of Britain, was on a completely different campaign when news of the uprising reached him. He was busy conquering the island of Anglesey, a sacred center for the Druids in what is now Wales.
I could talk about bad timing.
Indeed. Imagine the shock that must have rippled through the Roman ranks when they learned that their heartland in Britain was under attack and their formidable governor was miles away subduing a religious order.
So what did Suetonius do?
He acted swiftly and decisively. Gathering his legions, he marched south along Watling Street, a major Roman road that connected Londinium to the northwest. His goal was clear: to confront Boudica and crush the rebellion before it could spread any further.
It sounds like the Romans were finally taking this rebellion seriously.
They had no choice. Boudica's forces had proven to be a formidable threat, and the loss of two major cities was a blow to Roman prestige and control.
But before the final showdown with the Romans, Boudica wasn't finished. On her way to meet Suetonius, her forces attacked and destroyed Verulamium, another significant Roman settlement near present-day St. Albans.
Yes, Verulamium suffered the same fate as Colchester and Londinium. This demonstrates the scale and intensity of the rebellion. Boudica's reach extended far beyond her Iceni heartland. She had managed to unite disparate tribes fueled by their shared hatred of Roman rule and their desire for freedom.
So the stage is set for a final confrontation, a clash between the disciplined might of Rome and the passionate fury of Boudica's rebellion. And the disparity in forces is striking. Suetonius had around 10,000 legionaries under his command, while Boudica's forces, according to Roman sources, numbered in the hundreds of thousands.
Those numbers are likely exaggerated, a common tactic used by Roman historians to magnify their victories. But even if we cut those figures in half, or even by three-quarters, it's clear that Boudica's army significantly outnumbered the Roman legions.
So how did Suetonius plan to overcome such a numerical disadvantage?
Suetonius was a skilled military strategist. He knew that facing Boudica's horde head-on would be foolish. Instead, he carefully chose the location for the final battle, a site that would negate the Britons' numerical advantage and play to the strengths of his legions.
So location was key to the Roman strategy.
Absolutely. Suetonius selected a narrow valley, probably somewhere along Watling Street. This confined space prevented Boudica from deploying her full force and channeling her superior numbers into a decisive attack.
It's like choosing to fight in a narrow alleyway instead of an open field. You limit your opponent's ability to maneuver.
Precisely. It was a classic Roman tactic using terrain and strategy to overcome numerical disadvantages.
So on this carefully chosen battlefield, two worlds collided. On one side, the disciplined ranks of the Roman legions, their shields locked, their swords gleaming, a symbol of imperial power and military efficiency. And on the other, the swirling mass of Boudica's warriors, a diverse coalition of tribes united by their hatred of Rome and their desire for freedom.
It must have been a sight to behold, and amidst the chaos and anticipation, Boudica, the warrior queen, rallied her troops, delivering a rousing speech that stirred their hearts and fueled their determination.
Can you paint us a picture of that moment? What would it have been like to be present as Boudica addressed her followers?
Imagine the scene. Thousands of warriors, their faces painted with woad their voices, a cacophony of war cries, their weapons raised in defiance. And at the center of it all, Boudica, tall and imposing, her red hair flowing, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity, stands atop a chariot, her daughters by her side. She speaks of the injustices suffered at the hands of the Romans, of the desecration of their sacred lands, the rape of their daughters, the enslavement of their people.
It must have been a powerful and emotional moment.
You can only imagine. She calls upon her followers to fight for their freedom, for their families, for their very way of life. She reminds them that they are fighting for something greater than themselves, that their actions will determine the fate of their people for generations to come.
And on the Roman side, how does Suetonius prepare his legions for this clash?
Suetonius, a seasoned commander, knew the importance of discipline and order in the face of such a ferocious enemy. He reminded his legionaries of their training, their superior equipment, and the legacy of Rome. He instilled in them the belief that they were fighting for the glory of the empire, for the preservation of civilization itself. It was a clash of ideologies as much as a clash of arms.
So as the two armies prepared for battle, the tension must have been palpable.
Absolutely. The air crackled with anticipation, fear, and a desperate longing for victory.
And what happened when the two forces finally clashed?
The battle that followed was a brutal and bloody affair. Roman accounts, while undoubtedly biased, provide us with glimpses of the carnage that unfolded on that fateful day.
Can you walk us through the key moments of the battle? How did Suetonius' strategy play out against Boudica's overwhelming numbers?
The Romans, as planned, formed a tight discipline line, their shields interlocked, creating an impenetrable wall of steel. The Britons, on the other hand, charged with a furious but disorganized zeal, their numbers working against them in the confined space of the valley.
So Boudica's numerical advantage became a liability.
Exactly. The Britons, unable to break through the Roman lines, found themselves trapped, their ranks becoming increasingly chaotic as the Romans pressed their advantage. The Roman legions, known for their discipline and training, methodically cut through the British ranks, their short swords proving deadly against the Britons' less sophisticated weapons.
So despite their initial fury, the Britons were no match for the Roman war machine.
In the end, Roman discipline and tactics prevailed. The Britons, exhausted and demoralized, began to falter their ranks, dragging under the relentless pressure of the Roman advance. The rout was complete. Thousands of Britons lay dead on the battlefield, their dreams of freedom crushed beneath the weight of Roman might.
It was a devastating defeat for Boudica and her followers. And what of the warrior queen herself? What was her fate?
Faced with the crushing reality of defeat, Boudica, rather than be captured and paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy of war, chose to take her own life.
A tragic end for a leader who had fought so fiercely for her people.
Indeed, the circumstances of her death remain shrouded in mystery. Roman sources claim she took poison, a final act of defiance against her conquerors. But regardless of the method, her death marked the end of the rebellion and solidified her status as a martyr for freedom.
And with Boudica's death, the rebellion was extinguished.
Yes, her forces, leaderless and demoralized, scattered their dreams of freedom, shattered on that bloody battlefield. The revolt, which had burned so brightly for a brief moment, was extinguished, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a legacy that would echo through the centuries.
And what of the Romans? How did they respond to this challenge to their authority? Did they enact reprisals against the Britons who had dared to rise up against them?
The Roman response was swift and brutal. Suetonius, determined to make an example of those who had challenged Roman rule, unleashed a wave of terror across the rebellious regions.
We've talked about the events, the key players, the battles, and the aftermath of Boudica's revolt. It's a story of courage, defiance, and ultimately tragedy. But what about Boudica's lasting impact? How has her story resonated through the ages, and what does she represent to people today?
Well, that's a question that historians and cultural critics have been grappling with for centuries. You see, her story isn't just about a failed rebellion. It taps into a universal theme, the fight against overwhelming odds. That's why she's been adopted by everyone from Victorian imperialists to modern-day feminists. They each see in her a reflection of their own struggles.
Right, and we touched upon this earlier. But Boudica was largely forgotten after her death, only to be rediscovered during the Renaissance, and then truly embraced during the Victorian era.
It's fascinating how she was reinterpreted to fit the narratives of that time. Victorian Britain was at the height of its imperial power, and the image of a warrior queen leading her people against a foreign invader resonated deeply. Think of it like this. It was a way for them to connect their own imperial ambitions with a romanticized vision of British resistance against Roman rule.
So she became a symbol of both imperial power and resistance to empire all at the same time.
Exactly. And that complexity is part of what makes her story so enduring. But as we moved into the 20th century, her image continued to evolve. She was adopted by feminist movements as a symbol of female empowerment, a powerful woman who challenged patriarchal structures.
It's interesting how different groups have found meaning in her story, often highlighted different aspects of her character and motivations.
Mhm.
But what about today? What does Boudica represent in the 21st century?
That's a great question. I think she continues to hold a powerful appeal, especially in Britain, where she's often seen as a symbol of national identity, courage, and resistance against oppression. Her image appears everywhere, from statues and monuments to books, films, and even heavy metal bands.
You mentioned a beer named after her earlier, too.
Yes, she's become a popular culture icon, a figure who embodies a certain rebellious spirit.
But her story also raises some challenging questions, doesn't it?
Hmm.
We've talked about the brutality of the revolt, the violence inflicted on both sides. How do we reconcile that with the image of Boudica as a heroine?
That's the crux of it. Her story is not a simple one. She was a leader who fought for her people, her family, and her freedom, but she also engaged in acts of violence that by today's standards would be considered atrocities.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Exactly. And I think engaging with that complexity is essential. We shouldn't shy away from the difficult questions that her story raises. It's by wrestling with these complexities that we gain a richer understanding of the past and of ourselves.
So what do you think her legacy should be? How should we remember Boudica?
Well, that's a question for each individual to answer, I believe. We can acknowledge her courage and leadership, her fight against injustice, but we must also recognize the brutality of the revolt and the difficult questions it raises about violence, vengeance, and the cost of freedom.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to engage with the past in all its messiness.
Precisely.
Oh.
And ultimately, I think that's the most valuable lesson we can take away from Boudica's story. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of names and dates, but a living, breathing tapestry of human experiences, both inspiring and troubling, that can teach us a great deal about ourselves.
Well said. Boudica's revolt may have happened nearly 2,000 years ago, but her story continues to resonate today, prompting us to consider what it means to fight for what you believe in, even against impossible odds. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into Boudica's revolt. We hope you've enjoyed this journey into a pivotal moment in British history, and we encourage you to explore further, to delve into the sources, to ask your own questions, and to draw your own conclusions. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating historical events. Until next time, keep exploring.